In this video, I'm going to explore a range of responses to the question about the extent to which Stevenson's presentation of Dr. Jekyll allows the reader to feel sympathy for him, which appeared in the AQA June 2017 English Literature Series. If you're studying Jekyll and Hyde with OCR or Edexcel, this video will still be helpful, as the questions have pretty much the same structure, where you are invited to first consider how something is presented in an extract, and then how it is presented in the novel as a whole. The exam paper, including the extract, can be downloaded from the AQA website at the following address. And I have provided a link in the description section under the video. In the AQA paper, the question is as follows. Stevenson's presentation of Dr. Jekyll allows the reader to feel sympathy for him. Starting with this extract, explore how far you agree with this opinion. Write about how Stevenson presents Dr. Jekyll in this extract, how Stevenson presents Dr. Jekyll in the novel as a whole. 30 marks. Please note that this is not an exhaustive answer, nor is it an exemplar. These are just some ideas for you to consider incorporating into your own responses by adding to what you have already covered in class. In this extract, Stevenson paints a pathetic picture of Henry Jekyll. The premature twilight that covers the courtyard seems to foreshadow his fate. The window at which he sits, with an infinite sadness of mien, we know from a previous chapter to be barred, so the simile, like some disconsolate prisoner, invites sympathy at his seemingly self-imposed exile. The way in which he speaks drearily and sighed, along with the other words conveying negative emotion, such as sadness and disconsolate, communicates his depression and weariness. The fact that he appears weighed down by his problems elicits the reader's sympathy. The way in which he has to so suddenly cut off their conversation, with such abject terror and despair on his face, communicates his feelings of extreme fear and hopelessness. At this point in the novel, we are unaware that Jekyll's relationship with Hyde is any more than that of acquaintance, and we share Utterson's suspicions that Hyde has some kind of evil control over him, such as blackmail. Up to this point, Stevenson has presented Jekyll to the reader through the eyes of Utterson, and we have accepted his reasoning for the mysterious events surrounding Mr. Hyde, influenced by his belief in Jekyll's integrity, even though they are ultimately proved to be wrong. Earlier in the novel, he repeatedly refers to him as poor Harry Jekyll, and feels that he is in the thrall of an evil acquaintance who has some knowledge of a youthful indiscretion, years after memory has forgotten and self-love condoned the fault, which has come back to haunt him. This, along with Utterson's use of the informal Harry rather than Henry, invites sympathy by showing his warmth of feeling towards him. The way in which Jekyll rejects Utterson's offer of help, with "it is one of those affairs that cannot be mended by talking," elicits our sympathy. At the start, Jekyll is presented as a man of upstanding character who has every mark of capacity and kindness on his face, but who has got himself into an impossible position for some unspecified reason. We are led to believe that someone's appearance is an accurate representation of their soul. Cesare Lombroso's theory of atavism proposed that a person's baseness of nature and their consequent criminality not only was inherited, but was also evident in their physical features, such as the shape of their skull or their nose, or the size of their jaw or their eyes. Likewise, a person's good breeding and kind nature were also manifested in their features, and Jekyll, from Utterson's description of him, appears to fit this stereotype, which elicits our sympathy. Jekyll appears distraught in the immediate aftermath of the death of Sir Danvers Carew. He seems to be a man in the depths of despair who has unwittingly fallen into a trap. The reader feels sympathy for him because they think he is bound against his will to this murderer and is desperate to escape from him. He swears to God that he will never set eyes on him again, although alarm bells do start to ring when he lets slip that he was thinking of his own character, which this hateful business has rather exposed, rather than the appalling nature of the murder. It is only when we realise that Jekyll and Hyde are, in fact, the same person in the chapter Dr Lanyon's narrative that we, as readers, begin to lose sympathy for him. Hyde becomes a mouthpiece for Jekyll's contempt for Lanyon's approach to his scientific heresies, as he rails against a man who has so long been bound to the most narrow and material views, revealing that the two share a collective consciousness, and so Jekyll cannot but be fully aware of Hyde's actions. This is further compounded by what he reveals in the final chapter, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. It is a misinterpretation to simply see Jekyll as good and Hyde as evil, and it is in this distinction that our conclusions as to whether Jekyll deserves sympathy lie. Jekyll reveals that he believes himself to be commingled out of good and evil, and that, of the two characters that he has, one is Hyde, but the other was still the old Henry Jekyll, that incongruous compound of whose reformation and improvement I had already learned to despair. Hyde, therefore, is just one part of him, and is not a separate personality. When he becomes his alter ego, Edward Hyde, he is essentially still Henry Jekyll, but in a transformed physical state, where the strict moral code he has hitherto been bound by has disappeared. This allows him to act on his urges that would not be possible for a man of his age and social standing in Victorian London. At one point, Stevenson has Jekyll try to argue that Hyde is a separate person. It was Hyde, after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty, in order to distance himself from the moral responsibility for the crimes to elicit Utterson's and our sympathy. Stevenson usually, however, has Jekyll refer to Hyde in the first person rather than the third person, revealing that they are not two separate identities, and Jekyll himself admits that they had memory in common. Jekyll is not unaware of what he does as Hyde, and yet this does not deter him. The reader can only feel unsympathetic towards him. Furthermore, there are just too many victims who suffer at the hands of Jekyll's alter ego Hyde for the reader to feel sympathy for a fanciful experimental scientist whose initial dreams of separating and eradicating the unhappiness that exists in the darker self, so that man might walk more securely on the upward path, go so out of control that they end in a murderous rampage. We have already established that he knows what Hyde is capable of, when he trampled calmly upon the little girl, and yet he carries on. In his narrative he admits that he had no conscience. He was evil and wicked with no constraints. And this should be unforgivable in the reader's eyes. Over the next year he continues with his violence against nameless victims, which culminates in the grotesque murder of Sir Danvers Carew, which Jekyll himself describes as a mauling. Cesare Lombroso, in his theory of atavism, stated that these inferior beings had an irresistible craving for evil for its own sake, the desire not only to extinguish life in the victim, but to mutilate the corpse, tear its flesh, and drink its blood. Hyde seems to be a textbook example of Lombroso's criminal man. Although Jekyll's intentions can be seen as good and honourable at the beginning, his motivations change as his experiments continue, which affects how the reader sympathises with him. He is a man who is slowly losing hold of his original and better self, and becoming slowly incorporated with his second and worse. The way in which he, as Jekyll and not Hyde, with the most studious care, makes preparations for his double life by renting the flat in Soho, engaging the housekeeper, and arranging his will so he will suffer no pecuniary loss, are the actions of a cold-hearted, calculating and self-absorbed character. He confesses that no one could guess what degrading things I have done secretly, things which I must say in all honesty I enjoyed very much. There seems to be no remorse here at all, and in fact he confesses that it is his fear of being caught, rather than repentance, which curbs his behaviour. I think I was glad to have my better impulses thus buttressed and guarded by the terrors of the scaffold. And when he does finally become so appalled at what he has done, it was no longer the fear of the gallows, it was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. The reader feels it is all too little, too late, and they can only be unsympathetic towards this presentation of him. Thanks for watching. I'd really appreciate any questions or comments below. I look forward to hearing from you.